In the middle of the 18th century, the architecture of English poetry looked like this diagram. The era was governed by neoclassical rationality, a strict adherence to polished, symmetrical rules. Writers prioritized mathematical precision and logical arguments over raw emotion or mystery. Now imagine being a teenager named Thomas Chatterton, growing up in deep poverty in Bristol. To Chatterton, that hyper-rational modern world felt suffocating, so he spent his time wandering the imposing, ancient shadows of St. Mary Redcliffe Church, a Gothic environment that offered him a psychological escape door. Chatterton decided to literally inhabit that past. He invented a 15th-century monk named Thomas Rowley, writing under this pseudonym to create an alternate reality. To sell the illusion, he painstakingly cobbled together archaic words from old dictionaries and glossaries. He produced brilliant, highly emotional verses, and then presented them as genuine, dusty relics of the Middle Ages. When the literary establishment realized what he was doing, they dismissed him as a common fraud. Penniless, starving, and exhausted in London, Chatterton fell into despair and took his own life. He was only 17 years old. By the standards of his day, Chatterton was a criminal. Yet decades later, the towering figures of the Romantic movement would look at the exact same forged manuscripts and see the holy grail of English literature. The Romantic obsession with Chatterton comes down to two major poetic innovations. The first is psychological medievalism. Chatterton used the Middle Ages to construct a dense, atmospheric mood. In works like An Excellente Ballade of Charity, he deployed remote castles, violent thunderstorms, and supernatural elements as direct metaphors for extreme human emotion. This deeply resonated with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who developed a lifelong obsession with the Bristol teenager. Coleridge spent his entire adult life constantly rewriting a poem dedicated to him, titled Monody on the Death of Chatterton. Coleridge studied Chatterton's method of antiquating, deliberately styling a poem to feel ancient and mystical. He used this technique to create the eerie, otherworldly atmosphere that forces readers to suspend their disbelief in the rhyme of the ancient mariner. This diagram compares the two poets directly. If you look at the metric breakdown of Chatterton's poem The Tournament, alongside Coleridge's Christabel, you can see them matching identical 8-syllable rhythmic structures. Coleridge borrowed Chatterton's specific rhythmic pacing. With this structural blueprint, Coleridge had a rhythmic framework that didn't rely on the rigid geometry of his own era. This specific metric mask allowed him to move past Enlightenment logic and begin exploring the more irrational depths of the human psyche. This linguistic shift began as an accident. By digging through archives to simulate the 15th century, Chatterton unearthed a vault of raw Anglo-Saxon and medieval vocabulary that had largely vanished from modern usage. Ironically, while digging through archaic glossaries to fake his 15th century origins, Chatterton reintroduced a visceral English back into the mainstream. These revived words generated sensory nature imagery, vivid, earthy depictions of autumn that felt completely alien to polite society. This linguistic texture captured the attention of another giant of poetry, John Keats. Keats held a profound reverence for the boy from Bristol. Keats declared that Chatterton was the purest writer in the English language. He recognized that Chatterton was using genuine English idioms in a way no one else was. We can see the direct impact of this realization on Keats's own writing process. While working on his poem Hyperion, Keats actively abandoned complex, Latin-based Miltonian inversions, deliberately erasing them to emulate Chatterton's natural, earthly flow. Keats would ultimately pay tribute to his predecessor by dedicating his epic poem Endymion directly to Chatterton's memory. Keats realized that emotional resonance requires the raw, unpolished words of the earth, words that Chatterton literally dug up from the past, rather than the sterile perfection of the Enlightenment. To the Romantic poets, Chatterton wasn't a common criminal. They saw his story as a foundational myth, the archetypal neglected genius whose commitment to the imagination outweighed the demands of a materialistic society. They recognized that the Rowley persona functioned as a mask. It allowed Chatterton to experiment with themes and emotions that the formal constraints of the 18th century would have otherwise suppressed. By reaching backward into the 15th century, Chatterton handed Keats and Coleridge the exact vocabulary and the imaginative freedom they needed to push literature forward. Artistic innovation can be difficult to distinguish from rebellion or deception in its own moment. By reaching into a fabricated past, Chatterton provided the English language with the tools it needed to build a romantic future.